So, as you know, because you answered this invitation, this is a virtual book launch for a book that actually came out the end of July at a very busy time, so it wasn't feasible to have a launch. And then we did arrange, thanks to colleagues at Social Studies of Medicine, we're having an in-person launch here at McGill next week. But most people can't come to that. It's a very local event, and a number of you specifically asked that we do something online so maybe we can have this kind of conversation. So I'm delighted to do that. And as I say, what I'll do, see, hopefully this will make sense, is present briefly about the book, maximum half hour, try to keep myself within that, and then just field questions and comments and reflections and anything that you want to bring to the table about this. Yeah. So this book is the culmination of about 35 years of writing about metaphor and language in illness experience and in healing practices. And the title of the book actually comes from a paper that's listed here. I think it's the uh, fourth or so paper listed that was published a long time ago. And at the time, it was imagined as a chapter in a book of that title. So I made that, you know, promised to myself a long time ago that I was going to, put this together in a book and saw this essay as part of it. But such is the nature of an academic career, a research career in particular, where you're rewarded basically for the next grant you get and the database papers you produce from that grant, that this project kept getting pushed aside, notwithstanding having the time and finding the time to do further essays that were also around this topic and that try to push some of these ideas forward. So taking the time, having stopped a number of things in my life that cleared time to work on this book has been a really interesting experience for me. And I'm happy to talk about that too, because it's kind of some new, even though I've written lots of things, this is a new experience and edited some big books that involved a lot of similar work, but yet there's something very different about doing something that's um, taking one's own work and trying to put it in an extended arc. And that's what this book does. So about probably 60% of the book is based on previously published material that has been really reworked and updated and dealt with in a variety of ways in the book. And as I say, when those things were written, they were written with the book in mind to some degree. But there's been an effort now to see how much that can be put together in a long arc. I hope that that's successful. Um, the book is structured in terms of 10 chapters based on about 8 or 9 of those essays that I just mentioned. And the preoccupation of the book really is with, as I've already said, the ways to think about how language works for us in articulating suffering, in expressing, both afflictions of any kind. I mean, illness, of course, but also life trials and confronting, major traumas and other kinds of disruptions, and how language works not only to make sense of that, I guess, to give it shape, to articulate it, to express it to other people, but also in some ways to transform it. To try to contain it, to try to help it move forward in some way, so we're not stuck just with what things are. And the central intuition or commitment in the book is the notion that as much as there certainly is, and to my mind anyway, confidently a reality outside language and outside our configurations of the world that we bump up against, the ways in which we construe the world, the ways in which we talk about it are incredibly important for our actual everyday experience and how we navigate the world. And There is a big recognition of that in medicine at this point in the form of narrative medicine that sort of acknowledges the centrality of stories in people's own self-construction and in their self-presentation and navigating illness. But again, coming partly from clinical experiences and particularly working with people with physical symptoms, medically unexplained symptoms that don't get clear explanations, part of what has struck me oftentimes is that at least initially when people are facing a kind of crisis or a new symptom or whatever, many people don't have a very well articulated, elaborate narrative. So those of us who are interested in stories and storytelling are very attracted to people and to scenarios where people have a very rich narrative to give. And yet in the clinic and even in psychotherapy, oftentimes people have trouble, difficulty articulating things. They're groping, they're searching, they're tentative. And part of that process often is taking hold of metaphors. And using those to begin to get an aspect of experience. So I think that early sort of recognition, both from my own clinical work and then coming across literature in cognitive semantics, the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, talking about the centrality of metaphor in thought, seemed like a very good way into a better characterization of what's going on in language, at least initially for people. As I say, I think that the book also talks about how metaphors are elaborated or contribute to an elaborative process of creating a narrative and how that feeds back into the generation of metaphor. So it's not either or, but there's something important about not getting stuck in the notion of metaphor, in the notion, sorry, the notion of narrative as the final arbiter of experience, because there's something much more exploratory, more inventive, more tentative in some ways also in, I think, day-to-day experience, not only in illness, but that's one of the concerns here. So that's an overall concern, and it was driven by an early encounter, as I say, when Lakoff and Johnson's book Metaphors We Live By came out. I was very enthralled with that, and I felt it made a lot of sense to me, and it fit with what I felt was one of my ways of sort of encountering the world, which was often to notice that certain metaphors were being used in everyday conversation and to wonder about their connotations. So one of the things that happens in the book is every chapter begins with a pair of quotes from writers that I like, but in some ways there's a tension between those quotes. They represent different points of view. And that's one of the things that is apparent with metaphor, that you can describe things with a particular metaphor and that will contain a piece of the truth, not all of it, but a perspective. And yet you can often take a very different metaphor, even one that in some sense is opposing, is a kind of opposite in some ways, and that will also be true. That will reveal something else about what we're talking about. So partly that speaks to what the storyteller Gioia Timpanelli described as the prodigious complexity of nature, of the world, but partly it speaks to the inherent perspectivism of human knowing, that we always see from a certain position and we can shift positions and see something else. And I think that's incredibly important, not only at the level of sort of self-understanding as a person, but very important in the context of medicine. Okay, so this mentioning just again this perspectivism, inherent sort of partial knowing that's possible through metaphor, and how that implies a kind of epistemic humility in a way, very important in the context of medicine. Because one of the things I talk about in the book is the extent to which clinicians mistake their technical version of what's going on for the whole story, and end up stopping conversations and stopping the kind of open-ended exploration and revision of our understanding that needs to go on in a genuine engagement with someone. So that's one overall motivation for the book. The other motivation is a more personal one, which is, from for a very long time, like many people in childhood, adolescence, I became very interested in poetry and tried to write some poetry, but that's continued throughout my life as a source of sustenance for me in terms of certain poets whose whose way of engaging with language and the kind of intensity and surprise present in their use of language has been really reinvigorating for me, comforting, sometimes given me feelings of like really deep appreciation of things, let's say, and particularly appreciation of other kinds of worlds, other kinds of experiences, which again seems very central to clinical concerns, or for that matter, to ethnographic concerns of trying to understand people in different cultural contexts and life worlds. So that engagement with poetry also intersects then with this more sort of cognitive science point of view of metaphor that argues that metaphor actually is basic to the machinery of cognition, if you will, to really just trying to explain what's going on when people, understand something through language, and so it then intersects with this much more, what can we say, emotional and aesthetic kind of set of values about what language can also do for people. And so I'm speaking here to kind of very much to the underlying motivation. But then, as I said, we have this emerging work in cognitive science that talks about the idea that our ways of thinking about the world, engaging the world, are not primarily very abstract, sort of logical operations on our computations. They're embodied physical ways of engaging with sensory phenomena, with physical action in the world, and that connects us to the world in a very powerful ongoing way. So this sort of what's called 4E cognitive sciences, embodied, embedded in a particular place, extended into the world, and enacted through action. That kind of view has gone from kind of a somewhat marginal and provocative view to being, I think, quite well established and, if not the total mainstream, at least taken very seriously by lots of people, in a very productive area of writing and thinking among people who identify as cognitive scientists, as psychologists, as philosophers. And again, there's several people, several groups that have been interested in how can this be applied to thinking about psychiatry in particular and to the functions of language and psychiatry. So that's again part of what the the aspiration in this book is to take those ideas and apply them to thinking about how people articulate illness experience and how that might be transformed through language, through ritual, even through technical actions, because even the things we do of writing a prescription or somebody actually taking a medication or doing a physical examination, all of those things, as much as they have a very important and powerful material reality, also almost inevitably have a symbolic reality that's mediated by language. And again, that duality of the sort of material world, the bodily given to some degree, and the linguistically articulated and transformed is the duality or the necessary faces of human experience that the book is trying to keep returning to and insist that we need to talk about how both of those things are operative and how they shape each other, that we can end up with a kind of view of the mutual shaping of that. And metaphor becomes one of the ways to talk about that in more detail as a kind of bridging process, because the Lakoff and Johnson view, and again, there's a wealth of work in developmental psychology and other places making this point, that we learn language through basic bodily actions, that we learn prepositions like in and under and over and so on as babies or toddlers engaging with the world. And so that basic structure and vocabulary we have of objects and even of relationships is acquired through those developmental processes. And that then becomes a scaffolding for more and more abstract thought. And when we try to frame an abstract thought, we have no choice but to use that kind of language. And even though we might end up with a set of rules for how to use a very abstract thought that try to bracket off some of that bodily and sensory and so on meaning and try to just stay with a very technical meaning, let's say, we're talking about, a metabolic pathway in the body. We mean that in a very specific way. We don't mean all these other things, but we necessarily have to use words like pathway and like cycle and so on. And those are going to be carrying with them other connotations. And the argument again from Lakoff and Johnson, and this is an empirical thing that we can show, is that even when we've decided to use certain words or concepts with a set of rules that narrowly constrain their meaning, and we're going to follow those recipes, we're carrying with the language other connotations, other meanings, and that has huge impact on how we think, how we react. And again, clinically, it's very palpable that a clinician can say something to a patient that they mean, at least consciously, in a very narrow technical way, and yet it's taken by the patient as an image, as a metaphor that can be elaborated and elaborated in ways that may be helpful or may be harmful for the person in terms of what the implications are. So that's kind of the overall issue. And then it turns out you can take that idea and use it to begin to think about what goes on in healing practices and the great diversity of healing practices around the world. And some of the work that we do in cultural psychiatry and in just medicine in general in pluralistic settings is trying to figure out how these very different healing systems might fit together and how there might be bridges between very different systems. And I think, again, thinking in terms of metaphor theory allows us to begin to do that. So this is a kind of central diagram in the book that I use some of these diagrams to organize my own thinking and in a way to make a small map that show, preserves a place for some of these concepts and also gives at least a hint as to how they might be related. So here you can see at the bottom is what I'm calling the phenomenological neurology of embodiment, the fact that there's a structure to the body, there are processes to the body that give us certain kinds of experiences that come with certain qualities that we have to contend with in some ways. And there's also overarching stories or discursive formations or ways of construing experience. And our moment-to-moment experience is a kind of dialectic or a synthesis of those interacting processes. So we sort of, in the middle, I put individual experience, but I've also framed it as intersubjectivity, because for the most part, individual experience emerges in intersubjective situations. Certainly, again, that's true for a baby, interacting with caretakers around them. And throughout life, we're usually involved in conversations and interactions with others, either materially in presence, in physical presence, or through texts, or through in our imagination, sort of the virtual communities. Our inner conversations, in many ways, are still presuppose a kind of audience or someone there that we're in dialogue with. So there's that intersubjective quality to knowing that's important and becomes important concretely, and again, in the clinical setting or other healing settings where there are two people involved, typically a sufferer and a healer, and so on. You can see on the sides of this diagram that there are processes labeled, again, embodiment and enactment. This is not the full richness of how people use these terms, but it does speak to this idea that we can take these stories that we have, let's say, and live them out in our body. They reshape our bodily experience in some ways. We carry ourselves certain ways. We adopt a stance toward the world that's shaped by those narratives. And by metaphors. And then we have a process the other way in which we're enacting through bodily action and putting stories forward, putting metaphors forward, enacting them in our bodily stance and gestures toward others, and putting longer narrative structures forward. So I won't belabor it here, but you can take that kind of scheme and begin to talk about how language works in different areas. So, so an example is the way we talk about stance. We have a bodily stance that has major implications. This image from Blake, gives you a sense right away of the powerful communicative and embodied functions of stance, even though this is a very stylized and typically what can we say, kind of a romantic, gothic, whatever kind of image from Blake. It speaks to a kind of bodily experience that we can all relate to in some ways, and I think across cultures and so on. And at the same time, that bodily grounding is elaborated in notions of stance and that are used metaphorically to talk about taking a political stance, taking a moral stance, standing up to someone, and how we face life and so on. It's not an accident, that kind of traffic between the bodily experience that unfolds developmentally and the social experience of articulating our place in the world vis-a-vis certain kinds of situations and so on is not arbitrary. It unfolds within a culture, and it has implications for the nature of our experience. This is a similar slide that talks about something a little more abstract and perhaps in some ways the experience of time and temporality, and arguing again that there are things that are given to us in the body about experience of time and things that come from how we narrate time, how it is embedded within different kinds of narrative accounts, including the notion that we'll come to in a moment that there are ways of storytelling, ways of framing what's going on that are in the everyday temporality of the world, life events and personal histories and actions, but there are also ways of narrating that are part of myths that are situated in some sense in a kind of timeless realm because of the nature of their circularity. When you encounter a myth for the first time, it's a story, but once you've heard it many, many times, you already know the end before the beginning. It's all part of a kind of tableau. So in that sense, again, it stands outside time. It gives a structure to time that is beyond mundane time, if you will. And the book that's talked about quite a bit in relation to different kinds of experiences of grief and loss, the experiences of trauma, all of which have dramatic effects and alterations or disruptions of temporal experience. So one part of the book is using this kind of way of thinking about language and embodied experience to talk about variations in illness experience and different kinds of predicaments that people are in. And another part of it is talking about healing practices, as I say, ritual practices, things that we do, psychotherapy, other things we do to try to move in some ways our way of experiencing the body, our way of interpreting the world, to move it towards something that is less painful, more efficacious in some ways, more beneficial. I mean, there are many possible dimensions to all that transformation that we might seek and that we might succeed or not in achieving. So that part of the book rehearses this literature from social psychiatry and cultural psychiatry and anthropology on sort of universal aspects of symbolic healing, and tries to show how you can go beyond a very generic account, the one from Jerome Frank that I just showed, or one from Levi Strauss that I guess this one sort of represents, a famous paper from structural anthropology where Levi Strauss talks about the efficacy of symbols, and the idea that what happens in shamanic healing, if you will, is that the sufferer's body is mapped onto a mythic realm. Some kind of movement happens in the mythic realm, and in some way that carries along the body of the sufferer to a new state. And for Levi Strauss, that kind of explanation is interesting because it has this structure, this sort of structural organization. The problem for many people reading those accounts is that it doesn't really get us from structure to process, that it leaves open the question of, so how come the body moves along with the narrative account, along with the mythic structure? And there have been various proposals of how that might happen. An influential paper by James Dow argued what's happening really is that these bodily states are being mapped onto emotions, and in the way we use the word emotion, those are inherently transformative and mobile kinds of states. And so as the emotion changes, so does the bodily state that goes along with it. I think that makes some sense, but it doesn't capture all the levels and nuances of meaning that are present in any illness experience. It only captures part of it in terms of that kind of emotion map. So that's again where I think metaphor gives us a much richer way of starting to think about all the different kinds of transformations that could be occurring as one shifts in a narrative account, or changes a metaphor, or moves within a mythic space from one position to another. And so the book tries to talk about some of those examples. Some of these are taken from work done with Devin Hinton, the psychiatrist anthropologist Devin Hinton, and his work with people from Southeast Asia, where he's worked with people with different traditions who are able to use specific metaphors. So he modifies cognitive therapy in a way that reflects their salient cultural images and language. And so he's used this kind of diagram that I used originally in a paper on placebo, and he christened it a transformogram, which to me sounds a little bit too much like a telegram, but anyway, for want of anything else, anything better, it will suffice. And the point is that this is a basic structure. You see a parallel between, in all these diagrams, between the structure of metaphor and then the structure of sort of healing transformations. So the book goes through different examples of that, and then the central part of the book tries to say, okay, so if we want to bring together all these many different kinds of practices, many kinds of theories, and basically adopting the position that maybe they all have a grain of truth, where do they fit together? And a particular theory of healing, whether it's psychoanalysis or shamanistic healing or exorcism or Ayurvedic practice or anything else, has its own theory, its own ontology that goes with it, but it usually is describing just specific levels that are relevant to that theory. And we could stand back a bit and say, well, if those are all have significance, where do they sit in relation to each other? And so the argument is there are kind of layers of potential meaning that we're working with, some of which are embodied in very basic ways, our level of physical arousal, our orientation toward the world, some of which are elaborated in more complex schemas about the world, and many of which actually reside outside our own brains, our own bodies, but in our relationships with other people. Those are also structured in ways that can be transformed. And as many of you know, typically ritual healing in most parts of the world is not something that's done just with an individual. It's done with a group, it's done with a community. And the expectation is that the transformation will not just be in the afflicted person, that there are changes that are happening in the community, and we can understand part of its efficacy that way. Arguably, we can understand the efficacy of even very individualistic psychotherapy that way. Somebody goes to a therapy session and they find a way to re-narrate some of their experience, and they start thinking that way, and they start talking that way to their friends or to their family to some degree. And their family has to sort of absorb that and maybe ratify that, or maybe not. Maybe it makes no sense to the people around them, and that undermines in some ways the power of the experience that they've had clinically. So this kind of general scheme on the left, you see the sort of layers of meaning and kinds of subsystems or super systems that people are constructed out of, and on the right you see just that sort of structural arrangement, implying that there can be at each of these levels a kind of transformative process that in some ways parallels or even underlies metaphoric processes. So that's the central argument in the book. And then, as I say, it's applied different ways and applied to questions related to what is added when we narrate things in depth. I'm sort of skipping ahead because I don't want to really belabor all this. It's all there. One of the nice things about the book is I can say now it's all there in the book if you want to go read about it. Um, and but if part of, again, as someone who's sort of devoted a lot of my career to trying to argue for the importance of the social world in a field in psychiatry and psychology in which the assumption is everything that's really important is inside the skull of the individual in some ways. So the kind of pushing back and saying, and this is also what comes from the 4E cognitive science, the argument that even thinking is not really done entirely or exclusively within the confines of one person's head. We think with other people, we think with texts, we think with the material environment around us, and there are things that are irreducible. That you once you take away that, you've lost exactly that complexity of thought and so on. So that view leads to a different view of what these healing practices are and of how we might study them, not just as cognitive processes, but as social processes. So in the case of narratives, it leads us toward asking what makes one story more or less compelling for another. Or we could apply the same thing to talk about metaphor. What makes one metaphor more or less apt than another? Some of that is related to our own previous experience and to our bodies, but some of it is related to how well that fits with the dominant stories or with the form of life or with the social world that we're occupying. And again, for me, this is terribly important in terms of the ways we understand clinical processes, because not only do we in psychiatry tend to think, oh, all the important stuff is going inside the head, especially these days with the sort of biological reductionism that's taken hold in psychiatry, but also for the practical reason that we're meeting people in an office and we have a kind of keyhole view of their social world. We don't really know the depth of what their everyday life is like, and we may have difficulty imagining it if it differs very much from the rest of us. So this is a slide from one of the chapters that talks a lot about trauma and about landscapes of trauma, and the fact that when people come to narrate or transform trauma experience, they're typically doing it in a certain kind of social environment or context in which that affords certain possibilities for transformation for people. One of the later chapters in the book, and important, I mean, they're all important in a way, they're all pieces of the puzzle for me, but one of the very important chapters for me personally, again, is a chapter on the problem of alterity, of otherness and difference. And to some degree, this is motivated, aside from just life experience, which I'm sure many of us have had in one form or another, it's motivated by an experience years ago with a colleague who was talking to another colleague. One of them was a black person from the Caribbean, and the other was a brown person from the Maghreb. One was male and one was female, and so on. And one of them told the other, who was talking about their experiences of racism, I know exactly what you mean. And the person who had been describing their experiences said, no, I don't think you know. I don't think you know exactly what I mean, because we are differently bodied, we are differently gendered, we have come from parts of the world with very different histories, and it's a little over-eager, it's a little like over-invested in being empathic and showing how sensitive and attuned you are to imply that we're really the same. So it raised this question again of many of us go into psychiatry, psychotherapy because we've had some experience of being empathic and helping other people, but also because we kind of get goodies out of it. We feel good when we get to empathize with somebody and enter into a different world. Remember, William Carlos Williams talked about what a privilege it was as a physician to be able to enter into people's worlds in a way that otherwise, he would not be able to. So I think that's one of the rewards we get. But the danger then is that we exaggerate how much we're actually in tune with another person, how much we're really registering what's going on. So there's a whole question about what's the place then for acknowledging difference, not in a form of violent othering and pushing people away, but actually in a form of humility and respect for the other person and a kind of openness that allows us to learn from people. So this is part of what I take from partly from that encounter, but partly from then reading the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who tried to counter the kind of totalizing philosophy that Heidegger kind of came to represent with the notion of beginning of ethical awareness, of self-awareness, beginning with acknowledging the face of the other as radically other. and that's the basic human condition. And the implication then is even without empathy, even with just seeing the face of another that is in some ways unknowable to some degree, we have a moral obligation, ethical obligation toward that person, an obligation of hospitality and of care. So again, that's really, to me, relevant to medical care because it's not just people that we can be in tune with and that we like and we feel are similar to us that we're trying to care for. We're trying to work with people who are very different and maybe hard for us to understand and maybe in some ways challenging for us. And yet we need a stance that lets us approach that, not in a mechanical way that just, well, I mean, there is a technical way of saying, here's the baseline and we'll do at least this much care for everybody. But there's something beyond that, which is a kind of openness, a kind of vulnerability, a kind of respect for difference that I think we need to articulate in some ways and not just leap over with the assumption that we can just be sensitive and attuned, and that will give us everything we need. So there's an extended discussion of that, and it centers a bit around, or one of the example that I try to use to elaborate this comes from the work of the poet Paul Celan, who had his own very profound experiences of alienation, of suffering, with having lost his family in the Holocaust, ending up in France, ending up writing in German, even though that was the language of the people who'd murdered his family and his community, and winning prizes, literary prizes in Germany, and then going back to give talks and having weird experiences that he wrote about. Was anticipated for that matter in the sort of careful speeches he wrote, and then there's a famous poem he wrote where he had a chance to meet Heidegger, who very much wanted to meet him because he was really considered by many the greatest post-Holocaust German language poet, and he had a very disappointing encounter with Heidegger, in which he wrote about a poem called Tottenauberg, which talks about Heidegger's failure essentially to acknowledge his own errancy, his own having become an avid Nazi and never having actually formally renounced that in his own life. The other person I talk about a little bit in terms of alterity is another very important poet and philosopher, thinker, Edouard Glissant, who is from Martinique, actually the same place as Frantz Fanon. But whereas Fanon's critique of colonialism, which is incredibly important for cultural psychiatry and so on, has been mainly about all the violence that's done through the machinery of colonialism and racism, Glissant also saw as a poet and as a person who was fascinated by world literature and wrote about Faulkner and other people, also saw in the collision of cultures something incredibly lively and creative that to be celebrated in some ways. So this is the other side again of that alterity. Alterity is not only a challenge and a troubling scenario, but also an exciting energizing kind of encounter with what's different. So that's another kind of element in this. In the process of talking about transformation and these different forms, one of the things that I then turn to is these kind of mythic structures. And it's interesting because, again, there's a big literature in Jungian psychology. The book also draws a little bit from Jungian psychology and trying to maybe legitimate it in the eyes of many social scientists and psychologists who would see it as ill-informed because of certain ideas like the collective unconscious and very crude ideas of archetypes and so on. So it tries to talk about current refinements of those ways of thinking. And one of the dilemmas we have in Jungian psychology and Jungian psychotherapy, which I had my own psychotherapy for several years, Jungian psychotherapy, is that people are very interested in Greek mythology. But that's kind of what can we say? That's fits for people who are interested in antiquities or European history, but it's not necessarily a vivid part of everybody's everyday life. So the question is, what does mythology look like in our everyday life? And so I use the example of this film I particularly like by Nicholas Regg called Insignificance. That has a series of characters maybe you can recognize here, the actors playing respectively Marilyn Monroe and Albert Einstein. So the argument is these are mythological figures in popular North American, mythology. The kind of Aphrodite figure, although it's not. I mean, these are between archetype and stereotype. We could say an Aphrodite figure, gorgeous woman, but also she's a dumb blonde. So it's also a particular, invidious stereotype that's important in our popular mythology and how we think about people. And Albert Einstein is portrayed in this as the absent-minded professor. So yes, he's a genius and he represents sort of Apollonian wisdom, but he's also a bit of a bumbler and can't keeps is walking around barefoot and can't find his papers. They're all a complete mess. So in the film, these characters are present along with Joe DiMaggio, who represents the physically virile, masculine, powerful figure, and Senator Joseph McCarthy, actually a very relevant figure to our current moment. And they then sort of form a kind of constellation of things that through the course of the film begin to come into play with each other. And there's a kind of archetype, each of them represents stereotypes, that kind of archetype of wholeness that is created out of their interactions. So I use that example just to sort of, argue for the presence of myth in popular psychology and popular storytelling, and how in some ways that shapes what is sometimes talked about in psychology these days as master narratives. That there are dominant stories about how one is supposed to live one's life and, developmental milestones and ways we're supposed to rationalize things and so on. So that's another part of this process. And then at an experiential level, I use another film from this kind of, all these date me because these were very important films for me in my 20s or 30s, whatever. But this film, Field of Dreams, that Kevin Costner did, in which it's centered around baseball, which again is a very important American, not only practice, but I would say a mythological realm. I remember reading a book called The Universal Baseball Association or something, which is about a very reclusive, lonely guy who has an imaginary baseball league that he runs with all the statistics and everything else. And the whole book is like inside his head and playing that baseball league. But in this book, what happens is this guy who's been through terrible challenges and is really at a crossroads in his life decides to build a baseball diamond in his cornfield in his backyard in the Midwest, with the idea that he hears a voice that says, if you build it, they will come. And he builds the baseball diamond, and then these old baseball players, from all of whom are long gone, begin to come out of the cornfield and come onto the diamond and begin to play. And then it transpires. Oh, actually, I shouldn't tell you more because now I'm doing spoiler things, which I always get criticized for, telling too many spoilers. Go see the film. But the point is, in the film, there's a moment where the field of dreams where the people are playing is a kind of liminal space, a kind of ritual space, and things are happening there that are kind of magical. And at one point, there's a guy who is a physician in everyday life, but wanted to be a baseball player, actually the father of the protagonist. And he's playing baseball. He's actually fulfilling his dream there. But then something happens and he has to step out of that frame to save somebody's life. And when I was watching the film, I knew without, just because of the structure of things, that when he did that, he would transform back to his other self, back to being the wounded healer, rather than being the baseball player he always wanted to be. So the point of that, just to say that we can structure realms, we can structure ritual spaces, or in this case, aesthetic spaces, such that they have a kind of emotional logic. And without telling us what's going to happen, we can feel what's going to happen because we see that this is going to be a kind of transformation. So that example helps us to understand a little bit again what's happening when someone sets up a ritual scenario and how does it move itself forward logically without subtitles, without instructions for what's going to happen next, because there is a kind of aesthetic and representational logic that's carrying us forward. So that brings us to the penultimate theme in the book, which is how this then translates to the training of healers and to the clinical encounter. And this is a diagram. Originally, actually, I think a version of this or something close to this is from a paper by my therapist, actually, Jess Grosbeck, who a Jungian analyst who wrote about Freud and Jung as each other's therapists, because they had that experience when they came over on the boat from Europe to go to Clark University in the 1920s or so. And it acknowledges then that this idea of the archetype of the wounded healer argues that we frame the healing encounter, at least in Western medicine, as something that occurs between a person who's designated as a sufferer and a person who's designated as a healer. So that's the top row here. In reality, of course, every participant in that encounter as a human being has their own wounded side and has their own healing capacity. And if we conduct this relationship strictly at that sort of conscious level of those roles, then we're ignoring the fact that there's more going on there in that encounter. And so the wounded healer argues that inevitably, whether you intend it or not, there are these other layers going on in which the patient, let's say, as the designated sufferer, is aware of the sufferer in the healer, in the physician. And similarly, the physician can be aware of the fact that within the patient there is a healer. And so Jung would argue, and I, subscribe to this in the book, that when all those are activated, that constellation is what we mean by the archetype of the wounded healer. And that has additional efficacy. So you see at the bottom there, mythic image or archetype, that when those are activated, things can emerge, things can happen, people can have experiences that go beyond the limitations of the healer, and that another image emerges. And I give the example of the experience I had when I was in training of working with a woman who'd had a very, very difficult childhood, could not think of anybody who had treated her kindly. I mean, really, typical kind of devastating childhood, and who at one point came to therapy saying, I had a dream that I was in therapy with you, but you weren't you. You were this old woman with a kindly expression on your face, and I'm wearing a beautiful dress. And at one point, I float up, and my dress floats up, and then you reach out and you just, bring my smooth my dress down, and I'm left with a feeling of peace and comfort. I'm sort of shortening and maybe traducing the version in some ways. But the key thing for me was I'm not a wise old woman, and I, much as I like to think I have a few of those now and then, have a few of those, wisps of that kind of insight in me. What was happening was something between us because of our relationship, our mutual attitudes, our mutual openness. Something between us was getting constellated that she needed. Probably I needed, I probably benefited from it too. She needed to go forward at that point. So that's an example of this process we're talking about. And I talk about what it would mean to have a kind of training space, a kind of opportunity in which that kind of transformation was possible for people. So finally, this brings us to this another version of that diagram I showed you earlier, that on the left is embedded inside this loop. And in the earlier loop, that ring around it was called cultural affordances, and something we've written about in other places about the idea that the way in which we enact a culture, again, is not totally with the things we've learned, it's by being surrounded by the things that are constitutive of that culture and by knowing how to read them, how to relate to them. That's what it means to become enculturated, to become knowledgeable about a particular social world. So here you see that on the left, but what you see in the middle is this kind of interplay between the things I've been calling myth in terms of overarching stories that we value and that are full of expressions of problems of human relationships, and then the transactions and metaphors that occur against this underlying structure of what I'm calling archetypes, which in this case mean not only preformed bodily patterns or things that are just given to us, but existential universals. They're existential universal kind of predicaments. And on the right is sort of just the acknowledgement that we have different languages for trying to talk about those. And by insisting that things are related, we're suggesting that we need a way to talk about the links between politics and our own self-understanding and physiology. And I think I won't do this right now. This is, again, a great Canadian poet, philosopher, Robert Bringhurst. He's somewhere behind some of this, and his partner, Jan Zwicky, is very much important to me in some of this discussion. But I'll end with, or almost end with, this image of another friend and great poet, Toy Derricott, who has done a lot of work around the issues of identity and racism in American society through very open, honest, self-revealing poetry. Also a book she wrote called The Black Notebooks, because she's a person, despite being African American, who is very light-skinned and straight hair, and so can pass. And so she wrote a book at one point of just things she overheard over the course of a year, conversations she overheard that had people known that she was Black, she would not have heard. So kind of the stark reality again of that kind of structural violence that people live with. But here, her acknowledgement of the importance of being able to articulate somehow through language the kinds of insights and connections I've been talking about. So this is kind of the end. I'm going to stop here. I mean, it does relate to this sort of aesthetic questions that are at the end of the book. I promised you virtual refreshment. I wasn't exactly sure what I meant by that, but here you go. Here's a good example of virtual refreshment, this famous poem by William Carlos Williams, which I certainly experienced this as a refreshing poem. It means many different things, but one thing you definitely get is as a strong sensory experience of plums, whether you particularly like plums or not, because he's attaching to them that they're delicious and that they're cold. I think one thing you get out of this poem is that vivid evocation of that kind of experience, which I hope you've gotten a little bit of, even though this has been a rather abstract and technical poem. And I did decide, since Shane is here, and Shane, in our conversation a week or two ago, challenged me to, so where are your poems? So I don't usually do this at all. This is typically untypically risky things that I'm doing. But this is a poem. I also tried to, I realized part of why I don't present a lot of my poems is because a lot of my poems are kind of sad and depressing. So this is one a little less sad and depressing, which I think speaks again to that question that, because the epilogue in the book talks about aesthetics basically, because for me, again, this is part of the motivation, the notion that the aesthetics one gets from engaging with poetry, engaging with art and so on, is somehow really is sustenance, is really helps us. So the question is how and why. How does that work? And what are the risks of aestheticizing things? Because again, if I come back as an honest practitioner and kind of say, look, I'm working with people and often in very mundane ways, and they're not very pretty situations. And our goal is not to force something into an aesthetically satisfying situation. Our goal is to make things a little bit better. What's the tension between that desire for something that is aesthetically powerful, which certainly I want in my life and value highly, and the more mundane things that we need to do just to help each other in clinical settings? So the last chapter tries to talk a bit about that, about the tensions between that, and about the idea that, again, that can't be either or. Just like there's not an either or between world and language, there's not an either or between aesthetic moments of epiphanies and transcendence and the morass and messiness of everyday life. So that's it, I think. I think I did what I wanted to do. I'll turn off, if I can, the recording. How do I do that? There we go.